What if I told you that beauty, charisma, and power can be deadly traps? It sounds contradictory, doesn't it? After all, we always associate these qualities with success and admiration. But the story of Absalom, the prince of unmatched beauty and long hair that became a symbol, shows us the opposite. He had everything it took to be a great leader. Born in Hebron, son of King David, admired by the people, and gifted with a magnetic presence. Yet his vanity, pride, and thirst for revenge led him to a tragic fate. And between us, how many of us are at risk of falling into the same trap? Have you ever caught yourself seeking recognition at any cost? Or found yourself stuck in cycles of anger and resentment over something that happened in the past? Absalom's story is a powerful warning about the dangers of letting our weaknesses control us. He could have been one of Israel's greatest kings, but he chose the path of betrayal, unchecked ambition, and self-destruction. And in the end, he paid the highest price, his own life. But what about you? Are you willing to learn from his mistakes before it's too late? In this text, we'll dive into Absalom's life, exploring every chapter of his journey, from his birth in Hebron to his tragic death in the forest of Ephraim. You'll discover how his choices, driven by pride and vanity, not only destroyed his future, but also divided a nation and left a legacy of pain. And more importantly, you'll reflect on how to apply these lessons to your own life. Because deep down, Absalom's story isn't just about him. It's about all of us. So get ready for a journey that will challenge your beliefs and, who knows, change the way you see the world. Absalom, son of King David, was born in Hebron, and from an early age, his life was marked by a grand and turbulent destiny. Picture a young man of unparalleled beauty, whose long hair was not just a physical trait, but a symbol of his identity and influence. He grew up amidst the luxury of the court, but also in the shadows of family rivalries, which shaped his magnetic and restless personality. Absalom was the kind of person who, upon entering a room, commanded everyone's attention, not just because of his looks, but because of the aura of charisma that surrounded him. It was as if he carried with him a spark of power that drew people in, even if unconsciously. Have you ever met someone like that? Someone who, without even trying, seemed born to lead? Absalom was like that. He didn't need to shout or force his presence. His mere existence was enough to captivate. Yet, that same strength that made him admired also placed him on a dangerous path. After all, when you're that talented and beautiful, it's easy to let pride take over. And between us, pride is one of the greatest enemies of true success. It blinds us to our own flaws and makes us believe we're invincible. Absalom, in his rise, perhaps didn't realize he was building his own trap. Think about your own life for a moment. How many times have you found yourself in situations where success or the admiration of others made you overconfident? It's important to celebrate our achievements, but it's also crucial to stay grounded. Absalom, with all his beauty and charisma, could have been an exceptional leader if he had balanced his ambitions with humility. But unfortunately, he chose a different path, and that makes us reflect. How can we use our gifts without letting them consume us? Now, picture the scene. Hebron, a city full of history and meaning, witnessing the growth of a young man who seemed destined for greatness. Absalom wasn't just another son of the king. He was the embodiment of a promising future. But as in any story of ascent, challenges lurked nearby. The rivalry between brothers, the expectations of his father, and the pressure of being the people's favorite created a cauldron of emotions that, sooner or later, would boil over. And when that happened, would Absalom be ready, or would he be consumed by his own choices? Finally, it's impossible to talk about Absalom without mentioning the impact he had on those around him. His presence was like a flame. It attracted, it warmed, but it could also burn. And deep down, that's a valuable lesson for all of us. Our actions, no matter how small they may seem, have the power to influence others in ways we can't always foresee. So the question remains, how are you using your influence? Are you building bridges or digging chasms? Absalom's story is just beginning, and already we can see that his choices will have devastating consequences. But what about yours? What will you do with the power you hold in your hands? Absalom's life, though marked by glory and admiration, was also deeply scarred by a family tragedy that would forever alter his destiny. Picture the scene. Tamar, his sister, a young woman of pure heart, is violated by Amnon, his half-brother, an act of familial betrayal that would leave anyone devastated. For Absalom, this wasn't just an offense. It was a wound that bled silently, fueling a rage he couldn't openly express. After all, how do you react when the perpetrator is part of your own family? And worse, when your father, King David, seems to take no concrete action to bring about justice? Have you ever felt powerless in the face of injustice? Have you ever carried a pain so great it seemed to consume you from within? Absalom lived that. He saw his sister suffer and decided that even if no one else would do something, he would. But here's the crucial point. Revenge, no matter how justified it may seem, rarely brings peace. On the contrary, it often opens a door to more pain and destruction. Absalom, in his silence, coldly planned his retribution. And 2 years later, at what was supposed to be a celebratory feast, he executed his plan, killing Amnon, a tragic banquet, marking the beginning of his exile in Geshur. Think about it for a moment. How many times have we, driven by anger, made decisions that felt right in the heat of the moment, but only made things worse in the end? Absalom's revenge may have brought a momentary sense of justice, but the price he paid was high. 3 years away from home, away from his family, away from everything he knew. And between us, exile isn't just physical, it's also emotional. It's carrying the weight of choices that distance us from those we love. Was it worth it, or was there another way? Now, reflect on your own life. Has there ever been a situation where you felt justice wasn't served? Maybe at work, in your family, or even within yourself. What did you do about it? Absalom chose revenge, but what about you? There are other ways to deal with pain, like forgiveness or seeking solutions that don't involve more suffering. Of course, that doesn't mean forgetting or ignoring what happened, but rather choosing not to let anger control your life. After all, as they say, holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. Finally, Absalom's story shows us how family wounds can be deep and long-lasting. He lost not only his brother, but also a part of himself when he chose the path of revenge. And while he was in Geshur, far from everything, he likely had time to reflect on his choices. But did he learn the lesson? Or would pride and ambition still speak louder? The truth is, when dealing with family trauma, it's easy to let it define who we are, but the choice of how to respond is always ours. And you, what would you choose? After 3 long years in exile in Geshur, Absalom finally returned to Jerusalem. But, as the saying goes, not all that glitters is gold. His return wasn't triumphant. It was strategic. With the help of General Joab, he managed to come back, but King David, his father, kept his distance. Absalom was back, but he wasn't welcome. Picture the scene. A prince once admired, now living in the shadow of his own father, excluded from the court and the circles of power. It was as if he were in a gilded cage, surrounded by luxury but without freedom. And between us, there's nothing more frustrating than being close to what you desire, but not being able to touch it. Have you ever felt that way? Have you ever been in a situation where, no matter how hard you tried, something or someone always stood in your way? Absalom lived that. He could have given up, accepted his fate, and lived a quiet life, but he wasn't the type to settle for crumbs. Instead, he began to play a much subtler and more dangerous game, the game of popularity. He positioned himself as a defender of the people, someone who listened to their grievances and promised justice. And little by little, he won the hearts of the Israelites. It was as if he were saying, if my father doesn't want me, the people will. Now think about this. How many times, when faced with obstacles, have we sought alternatives to achieve our goals? Absalom used his intelligence and charisma to gain support. But was he doing it for the right reasons? Or were pride and ambition driving his actions? It's an important reflection because, in the end, our intentions are just as important as our actions. And have you ever stopped to think if you're pursuing your goals for noble reasons or just to prove something to others? Here's a practical example. Imagine you're in a job where you don't feel valued. You could choose 2 approaches. The first is to complain, create conflict, and try to force your way in. The second is to work quietly, earn the trust of your colleagues, and gradually show your worth. Which would you choose? Absalom chose a strategy similar to the second, but with a touch of manipulation. He knew that to win over the people, he needed to appear humble and just, even if deep down his motives were different. And that leads us to a question. How far are we willing to go to achieve our goals? Finally, Absalom's return to Jerusalem shows us how exclusion can be a powerful fuel for ambition. He didn't just want to come back. He wanted more. He wanted the throne, the power, the recognition. And as he gained popularity, King David watched from afar, perhaps unaware of the danger approaching. But between us, when someone is excluded for too long, it's natural for them to seek a way to assert themselves. The question is, how do you do that without losing your essence? Absalom was about to discover that his choices would have devastating consequences. And you, what would you do in his place? Absalom was no longer the exiled prince who had returned in silence. He had become a powerful figure, a leader admired and followed by the people. But, as the saying goes, he who wants everything loses everything. Absalom, driven by pride and ambition, decided it was time to take the throne he believed was rightfully his. And so, in Hebron, he declared himself king. Picture the scene, a banquet full of allies, fiery speeches, and the promise of a new beginning for Israel. It seemed like the pinnacle of his journey, but in reality, it was the beginning of a civil war that would divide families and nations. Have you ever seen someone who, upon gaining a little power, decides to risk everything for more? Absalom did exactly that. He wasn't content with being the admired prince. He wanted to be king. And to achieve that, he didn't hesitate to betray his own father, King David. He knew that to conquer the throne, he needed the support of tribes dissatisfied with the current government. And between us, he played his cards masterfully. He promised justice, listened to people's complaints, and positioned himself as a solution to all their problems. But deep down, it was all a strategy to satisfy his own ambition. Now, think about this. How many times in our own lives have we let ourselves be carried away by greed or the desire for more? Absalom is a classic example of how pride can blind us. He was so focused on his goal that he didn't see the risks he was taking. And you, have you ever found yourself in a situation where the desire to achieve something big made you ignore the dangers? It's important to remember that sometimes ambition can be a double-edged sword. It drives us forward, but it can also destroy us. Here's a practical example. Imagine you're in a job where you have the chance to climb the career ladder quickly. To do so, you need to make tough choices, like sacrificing time with your family or taking risks that might not be worth it. What would you do? Absalom chose to risk everything. But did he think about the consequences of his actions? The truth is, when we act solely out of ambition, we can end up losing what truly matters. And in Absalom's case, that meant not only the throne, but also the respect and love of his own father. Finally, Absalom's rebellion shows us how family betrayal can have devastating consequences. He didn't just declare war on his father. He also turned against his own people, dividing Israel into two sides. And as he prepared for battle, he likely felt a mix of pride and fear. After all, he knew there was no turning back. But was he ready for what was to come? The civil war was about to begin, and Absalom would soon discover that the price of his ambition would be higher than he ever imagined. And you, what would you do in his place? The civil war between Absalom and King David reached its decisive moment in the forest of Ephraim. It was a scene filled with tension and tragedy, where the fate of an ambitious prince would be sealed in a cruel and unexpected way. Picture the scene. Absalom, riding his horse, leading his troops with the confidence of someone who believes victory is within reach. But at a crucial moment, his long hair, a symbol of his beauty and pride, got tangled in the branches of an oak tree. He was left trapped, defenseless, at the mercy of his enemies. And in an act of tragic irony, it was Joab, the same general who had helped him return from exile, who killed him, defying David's direct orders to spare his son's life. Have you ever stopped to think how the symbols of our identity can turn against us? Absalom, who had always prided himself on his long hair, saw that very symbol become his downfall. It's as if life were telling us that No matter how much we cling to certain traits or achievements, they are no guarantee of success or safety. And between us, this serves as a powerful warning. What defines us can, in an instant, destroy us. Absalom, in his arrogance, didn't foresee that his greatest asset would become his greatest weakness. Now, reflect on your own life. What do you consider your greatest symbol of identity? Your career, your appearance, your intelligence? What if, suddenly, that were taken away from you? Absalom teaches us that it's dangerous to place all our confidence in something external. True strength comes within, from the ability to adapt and overcome challenges, even when everything seems lost. And you, how would you react if something you value so much became the cause of your downfall? Here's a practical example. Imagine you're an athlete who has always prided yourself on your speed. One day, during a competition, you suffer an injury that prevents you from running. What would you do? Would you give up, or would you find another way to shine? Absalom, unfortunately, didn't get that chance. His fall was swift and fatal. But the lesson here is that no matter how much we prepare, there are always unforeseen events. And when they happen, what matters is how we respond. Are you prepared to face your own oak branches? Finally, Absalom's death wasn't just the end of an ambitious prince. It was also the beginning of deep mourning for David. The king, who had fought to protect his throne, now wept for the loss of his son. And as he grieved, he might have wondered where it all went wrong. Could he have prevented this tragedy? Or were Absalom's pride and ambition inevitable? The truth is, when dealing with family conflicts, the choices we make can have devastating consequences. And you, what would you do to ensure your choices don't lead to tragic fate? The story of Absalom isn't just a tale of ambition and tragedy. It's a mirror reflecting the complexities of human nature. He was a prince of unmatched beauty, charisma, and potential, but he was also a victim of his own choices. His life teaches us that pride, revenge, and the inability to deal with family conflicts can lead to self-destruction. And between us, that's a lesson we can all take to heart. After all, how many times have we found ourselves in situations where anger or the desire to prove something led us to make decisions we later regretted? Have you ever stopped to think about how your choices impact not only you, but also those around you? Absalom, in his quest for justice and revenge, ended up creating a chain of events that divided a nation and destroyed his own family. And in the end, he paid the highest price, his life. But what about you? How do you handle the conflicts that arise in your life? Are you seeking solutions that bring peace, or are you just feeding more pain? The truth is, as difficult as it may be, forgiveness and understanding are powerful tools to prevent small disagreements from turning into tragedies. Here's a practical example. Imagine you're in a heated argument with someone close to you. Instead of trying to win the argument, what if you try to understand the other person's perspective? Sometimes, a simple shift in perspective can prevent a situation from spiraling out of control. Absalom, unfortunately, didn't have that wisdom. He chose the path of revenge, and it led him to a tragic fate. But you, what would you choose? Are you willing to let go of pride to build bridges instead of walls? Now, think about family relationships. How many times have we let past grievances influence our actions in the present? Absalom carried the pain of Tamar's violation and David's inaction, and it consumed him from within. But what about you? How do you deal with the wounds your family may have caused? It's important to remember that no matter how painful those experiences may be, they don't have to define who we are. We can choose to forgive, move forward, and build a different future. After all, as they say, holding on to resentment is like carrying a dead weight on your back. Finally, Absalom's legacy serves as a warning about the devastating consequences of choices driven by negative emotions. He could have been a great leader, but his actions led him to an early and tragic end. And as we reflect on his story, it's impossible not to think about our own lives. What are we doing with the time we have? Are we building something worthwhile, or are we just feeding cycles of pain and conflict? The choice is ours, and it starts now. So, what have you learned from Absalom's story? Can you identify traces of him in your own life? The truth is, no matter how distant this story may seem, it has a lot to teach us about pride, ambition, revenge, and the devastating consequences of our choices. Absalom could have been a great leader, but his vanity and inability to deal with family conflicts led him to a tragic end. And you, what are you doing to ensure your own oak branches don't trap you along the way? Think about it. How many times have you let pride take over, or allowed anger from a past situation to influence your decisions in the present? Absalom's story shows us that no matter how justified our emotions may seem, they can lead us to choices that only bring more pain. So, how about starting today to do things differently? Forgive more, listen more, reflect before acting. And above all, remember that your choices don't just affect you, they impact those around you too. Now, I want to challenge you. What's the first thing you'll change in your life after reading the story? Will you work on resolving a lingering family conflict? Will you rethink a decision driven by pride? Or will you simply pause and reflect on how your actions impact others? Whatever your answer, the important thing is to take action. Because in the end, life is made of choices, and each one defines who we are and who we can become. And if you enjoyed this content and want to keep learning powerful lessons like this, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any of our upcoming texts filled with reflections that can transform your life. After all, knowledge is only power when put into practice. So, are you ready to apply everything you've learned today?